I'm Rachel Stack, Chief Academic Officer for Humanities at Great Minds. We are thrilled to sponsor IDA's wonderful virtual conference, and especially this closing session. For many of you, Dr. Marianne Wolfe needs no introduction. She is the Director for the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. You may also know her as the author of Dyslexia, Fluency, and the Brain, Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, and Reader, Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. Dr. Wolfe is not only a tireless advocate for students with dyslexia, but she's also a tireless advocate for reducing worldwide illiteracy. She is one of the co-founders of Curious Learning, a global literacy initiative, which has the ultimate goal to work with groups around the globe to bring literacy to as many children as possible by the end of the decade, and thus to reduce world poverty in the decades to come. She's here with us to present How Science Reveals the Poetry in the Reading Brain, Implications for How We Teach All Our Children, which will be an excursion through the reading brain's development and what it can teach us about both universal principles of teaching and differentiated instruction. Her presentation will unite multiple perspectives around the foundational belief that whatever we learn about reading and dyslexia will benefit every child in every zip code, in every culture. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Stephanie Gottwald, and I've been given the great honor of introducing your speaker for the closing of the 2020 IDA General Session, Dr. Marianne Wolfe. I've known Marianne for 20 years now as my boss, a title she doesn't readily acknowledge, my advisor and mentor, my research partner, and best of all, my friend. I had a very different introduction written, but I feel like a lot of what I originally wrote can be found in her bio, so read it. It's amazing. What I would prefer to say about Marianne is how often I'm inspired and uplifted by her very big and grand thoughts about reading, and of course the work she's done within this field. One statement that I heard her make many times that especially resonates with me is that she has spent her life investigating something seemingly very simple, how the brain identifies a single word. Why that statement kept coming back to me as I thought about this introduction is how beautifully it sums up her work, a life's work. Because so much of her work has been quietly but deeply radical. In the double deficit hypothesis research with Martha Dankla, she maintained that within dyslexia there are subtypes beyond a phonological awareness deficit that were being neglected. And out of that work came the Rand-Raz assessment, which deeply revolutionized our understanding of the role that retrieval plays in becoming a fluent reader. In the 10 years of investigating multi-component intervention models, like RAVO, with Robin Morris and Maureen Lovett, she argued that fluent comprehension was achieved when children receive direct instruction in all the layers of linguistic knowledge necessary for understanding and using words and in the retrieval of that knowledge. In her books, Proust and the Squid, Reader Come Home, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, Marianne revealed the science, but also the deeply moving story of the reading brain, as it is now, and in what it could become in a world in which the medium of expression and reception of the written word is undergoing radical change. Her awards and honors are too many to count off here, but a few really stand out. Marianne is the recipient of both the Orton and Geschwin Awards from the IDA, a huge honor to be sure. But the great honor of her life must be her election this year to the Pontifical Academy of Science. She is one of very few women to receive this honor, and even fewer that are applying principles of neuroscience to education policy on a global scale. Well, if you've never heard Marianne speak before, you are in for a special experience. Her scientific and authoring prowess are wrapped in an uplifting and enlightening spirit that serves to remind us of the deeply revelatory journey that reading takes us on. She's among the few academics who can both inform and inspire. Her words take us out of the classroom, away from planning and analyzing, and really into the heavens to remind us that when the brain identifies even a single word, it is as much a spiritual act as it is a neurological one. So without any further words from me, I give you Dr. Marianne Wolfe.
Hello to everyone at IDA, and thank you, Stephanie Gottwald, for your comments. Stephanie is one of my dearest friends and dearest colleagues, and it's such a joy to know that she was the one that introduced me. Just for everybody to know, she is the proud grandmother of the most beautiful little girl I've ever seen. But now I want to say a few other words of thanks to people. Very importantly to Lynn Kuhn and Fumiko Haift and Tracy Johnson for all the work that went into putting the conference together. Thank you so much. And then my congratulations to all my dear friends who won all these great awards. To Nadine Gabb for the Geschwin Award. The whole concept of her talk on all of us being proactive in the use of science is such a wonderful contribution to us all that she's been making over the years. And you'll see some of my slides come actually from her work. Similarly with Malt Yoshi, who's done so much work over the years. I'm particularly excited about his emphasis about how we need to train our teachers in the colleges of education with the science of reading. And my colleague Laura Reinhardt and I and Sue Sears are actually doing just that kind of work in California. So I couldn't be more pleased with that as your emphasis. And Linda Siegel, congratulations on the Lifetime Award. So well deserved. And all of the people who are my friends who there's so many of you who are part of the Gordon Sherman, Al, oh my goodness, Gal Alberta, all of these wonderful people in the Gordon Sherman, and then the fantastic practitioners who are researchers too, like Margie Gillis. But I actually have to give the award for the most interesting title to my California colleague, Mary Helen Immordino Young, who is talking about the Frankenstein syndrome with, of course, reference to her work in social emotional. But I wish I could thank so many of you. When I saw the program, it just is there are such wonderful things happening. And I would like to now pull some of all of that together in a discussion with you as a way of bringing all the wonderful things you've listened to through the conference into a talk that puts together some of my work, some of the work of many of the people at IDA, and I'm actually going to reference them to some of the awards they got in my talk. But I want to emphasize not only the science, but the poetry of the reading brain, and how together you and I, organizations like IDA and Reading League and others, can really bring both the science and the poetry of our work, of our research into the classroom. I love the title of this conference. This is so special. Now I'm coming to you from California. No wool on me. And I'm coming to you, even though it's from my home, from UCLA, where I am directing the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice with my assistant director, Laura Reinhardt. And together we have a very special charge. And that is the mission for us all, that we will make a conceptualization of literacy for our world as a basic human right for every person, for every zip code, and I would add, as my colleague Stephanie Gottwald with her work on global literacy, everywhere. So what I hope this talk will do is to bring that concept alive to all of you who are working so hard towards it with our children. Reading changes our brain. Reading is a change agent, actually. When it changes the brain, it changes the life trajectory of that individual, which changes our society, which changes our species. And indeed, at the very end of my talk, I will be talking about the extraordinary linkage between the level of literacy and the type of literacy and democracy itself. But literacy is changing, and we are entering a very important moment in time, which I call a hinge moment, between a literate culture and a digital culture. And at the very end of my talk, as some of you know from my last book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, there are both wonderful promises and advantages to a digital culture, as well as perils and threats. And I will briefly speak about that as part of where we are now in this moment. And as each of us knows, we are in not only a cultural hinge moment between a literate and a digital culture, but we're in a hinge moment with our children. In California, the children are in their homes, learning through screens. In many places, there are all kinds of different arrangements. And we, in this beautiful organization of IDA, have an opportunity to help understand what is going to be the ineluctable regression that so many of our children have. And that our work in dyslexia, in this hinge moment, is also about insights from the reading brain, from the science of reading for everyone, for every child, but also for adults as well. And I'm going to begin and end my talk with the great novelist Gustave Flaubert. And he said something about reading, which I really want to give you from the start. Do not read simply to amuse yourself or even for instruction. No, read in order to live. And I want to say that to all of you this moment, because reading for us all is an antidote. Reading is a sanctuary. Reading is a home where we can go to. The next part of my work is to actually connect this very concept of reading for life to how each young child learns to read. And here is where this entire conference is about connecting the science of reading, the research on it and the practice on it, the applied and the theoretical, to what goes on in the classroom. This is why I think this is one of the most exciting conferences. And I'm so pleased to be able to try to pull some of it together for you, because what we're all trying to do is to connect this research on science of reading and the reading brain with our instruction for children who learn in neurodiverse ways, dyslexia being a prominent example, but there are others too. And the point of it all is that the more we know about the reading brain and about dyslexia and the impediments to reading, the more we can help all children learn, and our teachers learn better how to apply this knowledge to the real lives of our children with all their strengths and weaknesses. So dyslexia research is not simply about what we can do for children with dyslexia, but what we can do for all children. And this moment when there are so many inequities, which we will be discussing today, this research could not be more important. Now I'm using another Geschwin researcher, Stanislas Dejuan, whom I introduced to you actually only a few years ago. I'm using a quote of his to say why, especially cognitive neuroscience and education, are so important to have insights from one to the other in a reciprocal fashion. And he said parents and educators must have a better understanding of what reading changes in the child's brain. I am convinced that increased knowledge of these circuits will greatly simplify the teacher's task. And so my task is to summarize some of the wonderful things that you've been hearing all of the conference and all of the work that you're doing yourself to learn about the science of reading, and to bring it into a kind of a context which is very simple. And it begins, Stanislav Stojan and I had the same actual insight in different continents. The human brain was never born to read. Reading is an invention. And in fact, many of you heard me say this. What happens is that when we have an invention like literacy or numeracy, the brain has to build up a new circuit. And it's a plastic circuit. And it comes by connecting the parts that are genetically programmed. But it is not one entity. It will be shaped. This brain circuit will be shaped in multiple ways. There will be, of course, many things that are universal to the reading circuit, but the reality is that different writing systems will be reflected in different ways in that circuit. So if you look just at the very middle of the example, I always use the Chinese logosyllabary, you're going to need more of your right visual cortex to handle, by 5th grade, 5,000 visual characters. But by the same token, the very emphases we have in our teaching, that too is reflected. What we do or do not emphasize is reflected in the representation of the different areas of the brain. And that's why knowing more about the science of reading actually will be reflected in the circuit itself. And finally, the medium will make a difference. The advantages of one medium will be reflected in the circuit, and the disadvantages as well. And we'll come back to that at the end of our talk. But if we put all this together, what we have is a reality that this brain circuit is able to happen because we possess a design principle that allows us to connect existing areas in new ways. And that allows us to recycle and repurpose some of those areas. And places in our brain, whether we use Kent Pugh's more specific terms or Stanislav Stojan's visual word form area, we're talking about areas that become the home, if you will, of visual representations with consequences. These areas were for object and facial recognition, but now we use them for representing letters. And the same principle goes into other regions of our brain that are representing phonemes, that are representing the meanings, the semantic meanings, etc. But the point of saying all this is that how we represent things can be affected. It's not one thing. It's not one circuit. It's a circuit that will be affected because of this plasticity. And that means that when that child starts to learn to read, it's based on regions that have been developing for 5 years before it ever happens. I say this because it's really important to know the circuit, if it doesn't exist, it's going to be connecting components that need development. And these genetically endowed components are things that all of us know and know well, but we may be less able to understand the importance for reading than we should of those early 5 years in which we are literally developing the linguistic, cognitive, affective component parts. And especially language regions are playing such an important role for us. And I will just very briefly go over some of these components that the conference itself has been emphasizing in so many different ways. Almost every one of you has has heard at least one lecture that talks about phoneme awareness and its importance of developing these representations. So I'm not going to do that at an IDA conference, but it's important to first emphasize that that child from the start is learning to make the representation of their language. And we who are their environment, and this becomes so important for the 0 to 5, with everything we're doing, how we speak to the child, how we read, if we read. And this is a really essential aspect to the work of language development. Every book, every story, every supper time in which we're elaborating language plays a role in the development of semantic, syntactic, phonemic representations in our brain. And here's a slide I may have shown it with minor exaggeration on my part 1,000 times, but I show it every time because it shows one of the roots of our inequities as a culture, that so many of our children who are privileged are hearing instances of words, elaborations of words over and over and over again, so that by kindergarten, this older research, which has been redone and in very interesting ways at John Gabrielli's lab, another Gershwin Award winner, by the way, what we're seeing is that quantitatively and qualitatively, our children who are less privileged are often not getting the same kind of cultural linguistic enrichment. And Peggy McCardle has talked to us so often about this. But there's another aspect to what happens when we are reading and talking to our children. Those early books that children are hearing are giving them the origins of empathy. Every story is introducing an opportunity for understanding, for that child to understand how another frog or toad or child thinks and feels. And even though I might make fun a little bit of Mary Helen's Frankenstein title, I couldn't be more excited about the work that she and Rebecca Gottlieb are doing on really showing us the importance of the social emotional aspect. This is part of the reading circuit as well, and becomes ever more important as we move from decoding to deep reading, which I'll talk about. Equally important and connected to language is cognitive development and background knowledge. And here yet another inequity raises its ugly face, and that is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's that Stanovich Matthew effect line for vocabulary. I don't even remember when he said it, in the 80s, I think, or 90s, but I have never let go of that concept because it is as true today as it was then. And in the regression that we are all our children are going to be suffering with, it's so essential that we work in that 0 to 5 period. Here's an example with our pediatricians from Reach Out and Read, in which we really know, and not just from the grandmother principle, but we know from neuroimaging by John Hutton and others at the Cincinnati Hospital for Children, that those children who are being read to every night, they who, as I once wrote in Proust and the Squid, those children who learn about reading under the crook of an arm, they are having more activated language regions. And not just in the receptive areas, but also in the expressive. So we have very interesting results for our children, our young 3- and 4-year-old children from Hutton's group and others at Cincinnati. And they've been doing recent work also that I will just very briefly say is showing us that it's us. We are the ones who, when we read that book, who are conveying so much in our attention sharing and our elaboration of what we are doing, and that has an even better effect than if the child is listening to it in an audio version of the same story, and much not to my surprise, much to the surprise of many people, that human reading is so much better than if it's a video version with all the bells and whistles. Our children need us, and they need to have that shaping of attention that is so important. And so what we see again from John Hutton's work is that these language regions are becoming more and more active with us more than with screens. That is not to say that our story of screen has not a lot of positive aspects, and we'll talk about that at the end. But now I want to move us into the actual reading circuit, and I want to move us into looking at how that circuitry comes together, and then when it is connected in time and becomes automatic, becomes the vehicle, the springboard to adding ever more elaborated deep reading processes. But I just want you to have 30 seconds with this slide to realize that so much is going on in that 0 to 5 period, which helps develop the individual regions. But there's something else that's going on in this slide that I want to emphasize for those of you who are always thinking, what does this mean for us in our teaching? As you look at those first 3 brains, if you will, on your slide, you'll see that there's this important work that we are doing in getting that visual word form area to represent the letters, the letter patterns, and then connect them, which is the alphabetic principle, to the representation of the phonemes. And here's where I will say something that I also may have said 1,000 times. This information shows how important it is that our children get multiple exposures, that they don't just hear or see or have the beauty of authentic literature given to them with the hope that those areas will induce the rules that underlie the alphabetic principle. This is showing us that what, especially in our children with dyslexia and with other impediments, that we need to work to get multiple exposures. So those representations of letters, those representations of phonemes, and the connections between them are becoming automatic, are becoming fluent. That does not mean, and that's what the rest of this picture is showing you, that it's at the exclusion of meanings. As Connie Jewell said, one of the mistakes that people can make in early reading is to think that when you decode a word, you know it. We need not repeat the unnecessary, if you will, reading wars, as Jean Shaw called them years ago, to realize that the science of reading shows us the importance of being explicit and direct and systematic about all of those parts. The sounds, the visual representations of the letters and the letter patterns, the semantic meanings, the syntactic uses, and how they come together in context, in stories, in sentences, in stories. It's all important, but we have to ensure that those foundational skills are systematically taught. And that's where so much of your conference is about. How do we really help our new teachers and our teachers who were taught with other methods and who believe that the word balance perhaps in what they're doing is a true systematic balance? It too often is a cherry picking of a little phonics here, a little, no. What this science is telling us, and I think all of these different beautiful talks and poster presentations, I think if we would put them all together, we would have this circuit in front of us in which we see the dramatic importance of making sure those foundational skills are set systematically, explicitly taught, and connected to what we know about the meanings of words, their functions, and how they work in sentences. We are excluding nothing in the science of reading. And that's why I always add, of late, poetry to the discussion of science. Because what we are doing is making an automatic circuit so that it is proficient enough that it can add all of these very sophisticated comprehension processes. And I know I know Margie Gillis and others, maybe Nancy Mather, I'm trying to remember who did all this work on comprehension in this conference, but this is really important for you to understand that those foundational skills, they give us the automatic platform for adding ever more sophisticated skills that are like a spiral. The more you read, the more these deep reading processes are being able to develop. And so I want to go very quickly through them. For those of you who want to know a little bit more, my letters 3, especially letter 3 and Read or Come Home, goes into great detail about the deep reading processes. But what it does in the very start, now remember, this is totally interactive. All these things are happening, going back and forth, feeding forward, feeding backward. Information in the brain is really like a symphony in a way. But part of that symphony is to connect by analogy, analogical thinking. What we are learning from the text in front of us and making an analogy to what we know. And the beautiful writer Alberto Manguel talks about this, that reading is cumulative and proceeds with geometric progression, with each new reading building upon what went before. And that's so important for us to realize. The more we read, and this is as much about our adults and our leaders and the people that we love, the more we read, the more we know, the more the next time we read, the more we bring to it. It is one of the most beautiful spiralic aspects of our intellectual development. But now I want to never neglect the beautiful contribution of reading to the development of ethics and, if you will, the moral development of our children. The theologian John Donne talked about this aspect of reading as passing over, that when we are reading, we pass over into the thoughts and the feelings. And there's wonderful imaging research by Tanya Singer in Germany and other people at the Max Planck Institute there about how what we're doing is adding not just the regions of the brain that are involved in affect, but the very regions that are involved in our theory of mind. So by passing over into the lives and feelings of others, we are giving our children a moral laboratory. That's a word by Frank Hockenmulder that I love. He is in essence emphasizing that this is where we are learning to leave the egocentrism, the natural egocentrism of the Piagetian natural egocentrism of our children, and leave it. And has our society ever needed empathy more than this moment? Reading is an antidote to narcissism. Reading is an antidote to being alone. Reading gives us an opportunity to enter the life of other people. Now, I'm not going to be going through all the deep reading processes, but what happens is when you bring analogy and inference and perspective taking and all these things together, remember they're feed forward, feed backward, all these things are coming together. What we have is an opportunity for integrating them so we can make hypotheses and evaluate them and discern the truth of what we read. We can call this critical analysis. Critical analysis has so many different aspects, but essential to it is that we are involved in this dance between evaluating our hypotheses, going back and forth, a lot of right and left cortices are moving around there with their hypotheses if we give them that time. And that's a piece of the story that will evolve here. But what I need you to realize is that this is one of the most important things we can teach our children, regardless of medium. How do we discern the truth? And how do we give time to critical analytic thought so that we are less susceptible as a society and our children are less vulnerable to fake news, false information? And here I want to give the, if you will, the stage to, I believe, our finest American novelist, Marilynne Robinson, whose trilogy that began with Gilead now has added a new book, a new novel called Jack. I can't recommend them more, nor can I recommend more how she thinks about critical analysis. And I want to read this to you. If God has taken pleasure in his creation, some part is in your best idea, your most disciplined thinking on whatever is true, honorable, just, pleasing, and worthy of praise. This is deep reading at its apex. Deep reading is the sum of our best thoughts. But we must have the time, both in the formation of our children, and we have to have the time to give it, because it doesn't happen, especially if we're skimming on a screen and not realizing that the purpose of reading, for some of the things we read, goes well beyond what we might ever have thought it. And so what we're doing in the deep reading is giving, just as foundational skills give us the opportunity for all of those deep reading processes we just discussed, critical analysis and empathy give us the foundation for going beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own. That's Proust, I think, one of the most memorable lines about what reading is, when we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own. This is the moment, the sanctuary, the time of insight. It's as fleeting in milliseconds as can be, and yet it is a moment for us to think our best. And I call this the contemplative function in letter 4. In Reader Come Home, I spend a great deal of time, and letter 9, about the beauty, the science, where the science and poetry of the reading brain come together. And here you see Thomas Aquinas, who once was asked what he was most grateful for in life, and he said, "I'm most grateful that I could understand every page I ever read." May that be a goal for all of us, for all our children. But now, what do we do with this information? And that's what so much of the conference was about. How do we translate this information about science of reading into curricula? And here I simply want to say that so much of the wonderful work in this conference that is going on here and across, not just in the United States and Canada, but around the world, is really beginning to make our curricula reflect the beautiful complexity of the deep reading brain. Now, there are multiple approaches that call themselves evidence-based. There are multiple approaches that call themselves balanced. There are multiple approaches that simply call our whole language. And our last 40, 50 years have seen a debate. And I want to say that there's something to look forward to from the unusual collaboration of a group called the Peacenik. So I'm part of it, but really I give all the credit to Janine Herron and Margie Gillis and Laura Stewart, Margaret Goldberg, Jan Hasbrook, Jen Wazowitz. We're all getting together and we're trying to figure out how we can, in fact, bridge both science, our phonics, our explicit decoding emphases with an understanding of how important words and stories are. Now, the reading brain certainly teaches us that, but we have to be able to figure out how the world can come together and always with one goal. And the goal is, what is best for our children? What is best for each individual? What is best for the children in front of us? And we are working very hard to actually produce white papers, perhaps even a book, but we see a lot of hope. Reed Lyons sent an interesting email to many of us about some of the statements by people who ordinarily would be considered from a different perspective. Neil Duke, Lucy Calkins. There are very many people who are beginning to try to say, how can we use the science of reading in our own work? And what we would like to see is a more systematic effort to do just that, to really end any sense of a debate. And I think the best way to do that is just to realize that we need to come together always, always, to put science and poetry together for the best interest of the child. Now, as this entire conference, and I've just said, we know what to do at a certain level. We have to be explicit about everything. And we have to be explicit about its integration across all those components. Some of the research I even did with Stephanie Gottwald and Robin Morris and Maureen, we know from our data that the more you know about a word, the faster you will read it, and equally and even more important, the better you will comprehend it. So I'm going to move to how do we unite those kinds of principles with some of the work that's going on. And here I couldn't be more excited about the work that Fumiko Haft and Mary Lagorno-Tempany in San Francisco and Connecticut, and then Nadine Gabb at Children's Hospital and now at the Harvard lab. All of these wonderful researchers are helping us through various methodologies understand that we need an integrative approach. We need to be looking at all those parts of the circuitry, and we need to be looking from zero on. And here I want to highlight your work, Nadine Gabb, you who are the IDA Geschwin Award winner this year, how often it is that people have their eyebrows and their hairline when I say, it's important to know that the work we do in infancy to age 5 is very important, and that some of the differences that are going to be in the organization of children with dyslexia are already there. So we can do so many wonderful things before there's ever a diagnosis. Nadine has made so many important contributions, not only to the imaging, but also to always saying, and I know her talk, her address is all about that. How do we do this in a proactive way? And she and my former PhD student, who's at John Gabrielli's lab, but especially Nadine, has been talking about the paradox, the dyslexia paradox, where identification in grade 3 into grade 2 is often the norm, when we know early intervention is best. And so one of the things that Nadine and all of us are trying to figure out is how can we take our knowledge about the best early predictors, and most of you know that Martha Dinkle and I have been doing work on rapid automatized naming for so many years, and the whole field has been doing work on phoneme awareness. We know these are part and parcel of our best predictors, but how can we get a group of predictors together to really understand if we can predict more specifically before reading begins, so that we can match the mix of strength and weaknesses to our emphases in differential intervention. And here you see a slide that was part of Ola Ozernoff-Palchik's dissertation, and this is a project. To use the word project is really not the word. A huge prediction study that she did with John Gabrielli and Elizabeth Norton and Nadine and myself and others. And she found these 6 profiles, if you will, of differences among our readers by using a very large battery that then could be, if you will, reduced to a few major predictors. And this, oh, excuse me, I'll go back one more time. this very interesting set of profiles. We are now, Laura Reinhardt and I are going to be using the digital screener that Nadine Gabb has been working on, and potentially another study with the UCSF predictor. But what we want to do is to see if we can get a digital predictor that will duplicate what Ola and her colleagues found in these different profiles of children. And I'm not going to describe this, though, if their developmental science paper, for those of you who want to know, in 2016 describes that in great detail. But if you look at all these people who were working on it, Ola got the Career Research Award, Nadine Geschwin, John Geschwin, so many wonderful Geschwin people are on this study. I just did that just as a slight humorous thank you to IDA for all the ways that you contribute to our work as researchers by recognizing it. But this slide is a forerunner of showing that what we really need to do is to be able to predict particular profiles of strengths and weaknesses at 5 and use them to make better, more differentiated interventions. But in between, and here I'm going to go right to what Maud is talking about, our teachers need to be trained first in how to use predictors, how to use the results, how to know differences among interventions, and how to match the profile or constellation of strengths and weaknesses with particular interventions. Now, my dearest colleagues, Maureen Lovett, who was an Orton Award winner, and Robin Morris, whom I want to nominate for an Orton or a Geschwin or both, and Stephanie was involved in this as well. We did a lot of research under NICHD, and I simply want to say that there are several, I'm just going to give 2 of them, absolutely significant. And when I say significant, I mean that semantically and statistically results. And that is that the earlier the intervention, the greater the efficacy. And we all know we can make progress later on, but isn't it even more to the advantage of the child, so that we skip the detritus of the emotional sequelae that so often accompany reading failure in our children, if we can zoom in earlier and in more differentiated ways. And here, again, Maureen and Robin and I found some extremely important results when we compared more, if you will, unidimensional, good, solid, but unidimensional phonics emphases, decoding emphases, when we added multi-components. And that's Maureen's Empower program, which is so wonderful. Our RAVO program, which of course I think is wonderful, but I don't want to say that out loud in a talk. But what we're talking about are not the names of the programs. We're talking about the principles of multi-component interventions. And the multi-component interventions showed better lasting results than our more unidimensional ones. And so that actually is like a reflection of saying we're using more parts of the reading brain circuitry in multi-component interventions. And Maureen and Jan Fritters have done some extraordinary statistical work on our results over the years. And they, on one, and this one, sorry to say this publicly, but I don't see us ever doing this again in our lives because it was so beautiful. But the effect size for over 14 measures for this, these multiple component interventions was 0.99. Now, okay, we had the ideal conditions, ideal teachers. So I don't expect anyone to have that again, but I will be grateful for it for the rest of my life, and to Maureen and Jan for doing the work that showed it. Now I want to actually show this slide, which I usually precede with many others, about the beauty of understanding the strengths as well as ameliorating the weaknesses. And here I have two artists, one from LA, Ben Wolfe Noam, the other from Italy, Leonardo da Vinci. Slight differences in centuries and fame, but they're both, in my opinion, dyslexic. The one I know for sure because he's my son. The other I've been studying historically, and I believe that the extraordinary mix of strengths and weaknesses that Leonardo da Vinci showed may be the finest example of the extremes in strengths and the unlikely occurrence of weaknesses in an Italian-speaking genius. But I believe both of them show us that is the mix of the challenges of this great, beautiful brain and its strengths that we have to always keep in mind. That is the balance that I want us to always think about. We have to preserve the spirit of that child who has those challenges so that those strengths over time, whatever they may be, will emerge. So we have a job that is not simply an academic job that looks at the cognitive, linguistic, et cetera, but also the affective. And our interventions must also reflect that. And I use this quote from the Psalm 118, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." May that be true. May that be true for all the children you and I teach, the teachers we teach, the parents that we are with, so that they understand the great strengths that will emerge with all our help. But there's something that goes way outside our normal way of dealing with a conference on our beautiful theories and our applied practices. And that is the reality that this moment in time has exposed. Not only do we have COVID making us really deal with mortality and with so many of these difficult issues, but in addition to health-related issues, it has exposed our educational inequities around the world. And I return to this same slide from before, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we must not let that happen. And there are things that we have to confront. The NAEP has done for us a cartography of our inequities. If you look at all of these cities, I'm looking at Atlanta, where our Caucasian children have levels of proficiency that are very high percentages, followed by children 50 percentage points less for our children of color. I look at my Los Angeles and I see, again, this horror story that only 41% of our kids, 4th grade, 8th grade, are becoming proficient, while only 10%, 16% of our kids of color. There are all kinds of reasons why, and some of them are reducible to poverty and SES and the inequities. And Ola Ozernoff-Palchik again has done some of the research that show us that children from underprivileged homes who were at risk at kindergarten were significantly more likely to experience great reading risks. We have the work of my colleague and friend, Sean Robinson, who some of you may know as the Dr. Dyslexia dude, who's done some wonderful work with Julie Washington and Corey Thompson and others, has special issues on the particular trajectory of African-American boys who are dyslexic. But it is our shared story that we must redress. And this form of inequity is going to have effects for the next at least 2 years. And you and I are going to be first responders. We are going to try to use the science of reading that you are learning about, that you have, for some of you, been doing this research for years and years. For some of you, you've been in the classroom for years and years doing this. Our work has only grown harder, but I believe the rewards will be even greater because we now know so much more than we ever did before. But we have another challenge, and I'm going to spend just a few more minutes talking about this challenge, which was the content of my last book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. There are differences in the circuit because of the medium. And COVID has made us even more reliant on the screen than ever before. So it behooves us to know the advantages and disadvantages that are involved. My colleague at UCLA, Patricia Greenfield, and Laura Reinhardt have been doing some of this research in which we realize, and she realized this from her particular area, and I realized it from the reading area, that every medium has its cost and its weaknesses, but the cost in the digital medium, which advantages fast processing, a lot of information, multitasking, those advantages have disadvantages, cost for deep reading. And I need at this moment in time to be sure that we're not talking in a binary way that this is good and this is bad. This slide comes from Curious Learning, taken by Tinsley Gallion and used by Stephanie Gottwald and myself in the work that I helped co-create, but they have taken it around the world at the Curious Learning's Global Literacy Initiative. And they have shown that this can be such an important tool for the building and the practice of foundational skills. So it is not the case that I'm saying technology has these pernicious effects. Technology is a medium that we want to use wisely and well, and it can be of essential help in the practice with our children who are struggling with those foundational skills and giving a dissemination of background knowledge. Two things that are extremely important. We need practice and we need background knowledge for our children. And for children in many places, we need the democratization of knowledge that the digital world can help us do. And Curious Learning and other initiatives like it are in, Curious Learning certainly is in many places, Africa, India, Australia, rural US. Stephanie Gottwald, who is a linguist, has helped ensure that a precursor app for literacy called Feed the Monster now is I think 47 translations, but however many it is now, the point is we have much that we can do, and a lot of the work that has gone into the science of reading is now going into this work in global literacy. But there's another use, and that has been very much a privilege of mine to work with the Haskins Lab, Ken Pugh, as you know, who was another Gershwin, and Maureen Lovett, Peggy McCarter. I don't know all the awards Peggy's gotten. I should have put those down too. Fumiko, Ben Powis, who does so much work with IDA and so many different people from AIM Institute. I mean, I don't even want to name all the people who are involved, but it's a network. And we've been trying to work together, if not weekly, every other week, on trying to produce a resource library of evidence-based, as much as possible, curated apps that are free for children who are in the earliest period, that's 0 to 5. Judy Koch from Bring Me a Book is helping us find what are the absolute best books, for example, for that group. We then have a set of apps that go after those foundational skills in the early readers group, and then developing readers, and people like Leanne Borders from Bookalicious, Andrea Johnson from Rally Reader. They're all helping us try to give in this context a set of free resources for parents and educators during this moment of a true hinge, in which the assets of the digital medium can be of great help to us. But I do not want to simply talk about the assets without giving us the vigilance we need to be a wise group of people using different mediums, because there's evidence, like my colleague and former and friend Barry Zuckerman and Catherine Hirsch-Pasek. There are many people who are doing work that show that all these bells and whistles are not as good as humans for the development of language during those early periods. And clinicians like Catherine Steiner-Adair talk about the differences in attention, then that the quality of attention is being really challenged by the constant distraction. Linda Stone used to use the term that our children on these screens and on this medium are really being exposed to continuous partial attention. We have to be aware of the effects of that on our children and our young adults. And here I'm going to give you a very important meta-analysis, a huge one, from my colleagues who are part of the eRead network. And there are two whole groups. There's one in Europe and Israel, and Mengen, Naomi Barron, Tommy Katsir, a dear PhD, former PhD student who is directing wonderful work in intervention and reading and neuroscience in Haifa, as well as Marie Barzilai, another fabulous PhD student. They're all doing this work within both their universities and the eRead network. One of the major studies that has come out is on young adults who simply read the same story on a screen or in print. And over 171,000 participants are now in this analyzed pool. It took place from 2000 to 2017. And the effect of print on comprehension is so much better than the comprehension when the young adults are reading on the screen. Same material. Now, Rakefet Ackerman went deeper and found out why. The young adults are thinking that if they read faster, which they do on the screen, they will read better. And the opposite, the converse, is true. The last sub-analysis of this was, to me, the most, if you will, provocative for me personally, because I thought that digital natives, the ones who were analyzed last in the study, would actually show a difference from the rest of the participants. The reality was the opposite, that the most recent participants, in other words, the true digital natives, had an even stronger comprehension effect in print than screen. We have to understand what is happening. We have to realize that the new norm, as Professor Liu from San Jose has told us, we are now all skimmers. But the result is that when we skim, we are giving less time to the quality of attention, to the consolidation of memory, and to the deep reading skills that we must preserve. The poet T.S. Eliot asked this question: where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? And I ask you today, where is the knowledge lost in information? We are bombarded with information. And if we are so bombarded that we are skimming and reducing the use of those deep reading skills, there are implications for all of us and for our society, because we will actually be giving ourselves less time to understand complexity. There is nothing worse than the very idea that complex concepts can be conveyed by a tweet, much less have a kind of reading and writing that is in a tweet-like style. At the same time, not only are we potentially losing some of the complexity in what we are reading, we may, as David Brooks once said, find that beauty went missing. Our perception of beauty, and Marilyn Robinson said this, is contributing to our understanding, to how we think. But more ominous, more insidious is that the effect could also be that that skim allows us to think we know the truth before we've ever analyzed it. That was actually Socrates' worry about reading itself. But it might make too many of us more susceptible to false information, more likely to go into silos of familiar information, which we do not analyze, which means we are susceptible to not just false news, but false fears, false hopes, and demagoguery. These are the threats to society, which we who are those who teach reading, we must never let go of that connection, not just to the child, but to democracy itself. As Umberto Eco, the novelist, and Cardinal Martini said, the delicate game of democracy provides for a dialectic of opinions. Such exchanges will expand the collective moral conscience, or not. And here is where I'm going to leave you softly, if you will, with the next 3 or 4 slides. We have to be the stewards. We know so much about that reading brain, and we must be aware of its differences in not only children, but also mediums. As the philosopher Martha Nussbaum said, it would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who've lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. I am pre-recording this moment. I do not know what has happened to our nation, but I know that what we need to do, regardless of outcome, is to take seriously our stewardship of that next generation. I do not and will not want to leave you with the thought that I'm saying one medium is bad or pernicious and the other is better. It is the aspiration for wisdom, for preserving deep reading in our children and expanding digital skills that I am after. I write about a biliterate brain in these books that I have written recently, or the Guardian articles, but they are all about applying our best knowledge. If I believe, as I still do, that the research tells us that we read best, we learn to read best on print in the early years, at the same time, I want us to always be teaching the coding and programming skills from the digital world and to be using them for practice and for background knowledge, and in places where there are no other resources. As Curious Learning has taught me, it can be one of our greatest tools for the democratization of knowledge. We need to think. We do not have the answer, but we need to think about what will make us able to preserve the deep reading and expand it. And so the areas of systemic change, which I would like to leave you with, are the idea that we need to, as a group, unite and integrate all those campaigns around the country that are increasing language and conceptual development between 0 to 5, that we work with pediatricians, that we work to get digital screening if it works out to be a good tool for prediction, or other tools, but that we have early 5-year-old prediction batteries that will help us give differential intervention, and that our teachers, as Malt has insisted, our teachers learn this, and they learn it not just in the early parts of elementary grades, but all throughout those elementary years, all the way through high school, to understand how we can do a better job of giving deep reading, deep literacy, deep thought to all our children. And that will take an entire country, an entire cartography for us to bring that science of reading through our organizations like IDA Reading League to professional development at the city level, county level, state level, national level, global level. And so I'm going to end with an aspiration for all of you. I want us to think like Flaubert, and this was a quote that Stephanie once gave me years ago. I want us to think about the poetry of language and the science. Flaubert said that language is like a cracked kettle on which we beat crude rhythms for bears to dance to, all the while we wish to make music that will melt the stars. That's what I want for our children, for their experience of written language. I want them to have the experience in which their thoughts aspire to reach the stars. May you teach them to do just that. I thank you, every single one of you, for all the work you are doing to put together this conference, and after it is over, to take what we know into the lives of our children. Godspeed to you each, and be well. Thank you.